Hi there. Thank you for coming to my talk. This is my 25th KP, every one since 2011, except for the broken years. I will start with the customary apology for sending a low fidelity avatar this time. All of our local CPU is going to modeling for a hurricane damper being deployed next week. So, speaking at Solmukohta is kind of like coming home. It's really lovely. My first KP was right before Occupy, for the other elders in the room who still remember it, who were around then. One of the inflection points, Occupy was one of the inflection points in the 20-year drift away from the Atlantic Compromise of the 20th century before the emergencies started. It's a relevant milestone here because its legacy was largely about the experience of culture design as a change driver. Right? It was one of the first big events that really made us understand that all of the stuff that we'd been talking about through the 90s and the 2000s about, consensus, reality, all of this stuff, it was one of the places where that actually shipped at scale in ways that were surprising at the time. Now, of course, we didn't realize what it had done then in the same way that we didn't realize, a lot of the big changes until they echoed on later. The other thing which is interesting about Occupy as a legacy and why it's relevant here is it bled into the first information war in the teens, which, as we know, has echoed, at least for the 20 or so years after that. Since I joined the community, much of my work has been about tying Larp traditions to larger theoretical currents and movements, and it should come as no surprise that I will continue that today. As always, I will also reserve my right to be, as an old fogey, to be ornery and discursive. You have been warned. You are welcome to watch this and fast forward later or read the auto summary if you'd like the more linear version. Anyway, so I've got a few themes that I'd like to talk about today, and we'll see where they lead. The first big one is scale. Scale is interesting because Larp has become more instrumentalized in part, but also, and again, I know that this is going to be new for some of you who are younger and who haven't seen things as the way they were before. But as part of the new culture movements, we've managed to see Larp as, yes, instrumentalized and yes, a more explicit design tool, but also we've recentered art as part of the structure of social design and collective governance in a way that didn't really seem possible when we started doing this work. If we ignore online play, and yes, I can hear you sighing about the out-of-touch meathead, but I think I've made my point enough times about the role of the body. And I think the resilient LARPing conversation has made my point there about the complexities of online-only play as well. However, to my point, most of our scaling advantages have actually centered on production efficiency. This is something which is interesting because in the first 20 or 30 years of LARPing, we didn't really teach this in the same way, right? It wasn't, we had schools that taught design, but we didn't have schools that taught production. Now, part of this, of course, is that the spread of supply chain thinking that came out of the rebalance really just shifted our own understanding of what it means to do work in the world at scale. The teams that produce games now are smaller, they're more focused, we have better tooling support, but also we've learned how to use Slack, we've learned how to use efficiency, we've learned how to use just in time and not just in time and stores balance and kind of to manage the way we use our resources as a community, which has let us produce both somewhat larger events, although at least in physical play, the medium still has real scaling limits, and that's fine. That's part of the artistic side of the process. But moreover, it's let us run events faster. It's meant that we've stopped burning people out in the same way. It used to be a thing that, you would produce an event and half the time, somebody might leave the community or not do anything else for years because of the impact on them. Production management and teaching production management collectively has really changed that. And what this has meant as a culture design tool And as one of the cores of the new cultures movement is it's meant that we've been able to have these big, slow conversations about how we live and how we want to live in a way that's given us a much more nuanced ability to communicate and just sort of a different mode of talking and working together. If you'd asked me 30 years ago when I was fresh into the scene, I think I might have seen some of the potential then, but the idea that we would actually get to have impact at this scale and that it wouldn't, the collaborative aspects of it would end up still being such a core part of that, I think would have been a real surprise. It used to be that there was this sort of expectation that the only way to scale something is to make it commodified and sort of alienated, et cetera, and that you can't keep the emotional engagement, you can't keep the body in things, you can't keep the collaborative and collective ownership of things when they get big enough. And that's something that production has actually taught us that we can do, still with limits. It's still not an efficient tool for some uses. For instance, while a bunch of states tried to make LARP a core tool in information campaigns and information war campaigns, it never really worked because there are enough of the politics of collectivity baked into the tool that there's certain kinds of scaling that it just doesn't do. The next big thing that I want to talk about is duration. The long emergency that the post-plague rebalance kicked off and the shift to holistic systems management that followed has been really kind of a whiplash shift in the timescales we think in. And of course, LARP has not been immune to this. I think it is, again, if you're younger now and you didn't grow up under kind of turn of the century hypercapitalism, it's difficult for you to imagine a world in which kind of quarter by quarter planning was considered long-term thinking. It's just sort of, it's unreal now that we used to live that way. And it's been honestly difficult for those of us who grew up in that. The change has been hard, but what it has done, and I'll try and stick to LARP here, what it has done in a LARP context has really profoundly changed our collective tool, playing the very long game. It used to be that 5 days was considered a long time for a big LARP. And, of course, there were much shorter ones, and there still are much shorter ones. But, the idea, it's sort of de rigueur to mention Always Coming Home, the Le Guin LARP that's running in the NorCal exclusion zone. It's now entering its 15th year of runtime. This was sort of unreal. I remember during the first information war, we used to have people talking about, kind of derisively about people LARPing the revolution as though that was somehow like a thing that made that an unworthy mode of political exploration. Now, of course, the problem was that the people doing this weren't actually LARPing the revolution. The idea of viral LARP as a collective social tool for redesign and for kind of mindset change and harmonization was not, I won't say it was unheard of, but it had never been put into practice. No one had actually shipped anything that worked that way. So yeah, I think duration is one of the things which has changed both us and LARP the most. And now I want to talk about weird. And I know framing things as the new weird is still slightly controversial. There are folks who think it's rude, but this is a way that I've been thinking about it at least for a long time. When I started, and really throughout the 50 years that we've been playing, LARP has always been a tool of escapism as well as imagination and as well as exploration. This has always been okay. It took us a long time to come to terms with the fact that, escapism is simply part of life when you're dealing with stress and pressure, which we always have been. When I joined the community, the big escapism in the Nordic scene was misery LARPing. It was this kind of, we have lives that are pretty good. The structures of our lives broadly work. The thing that we don't experience is the negative in the same way. And, and obviously that's complicated and that's, I'm wildly oversimplifying in this statement, but it's simply become less relevant because it's not a thing that most of us need. And also part of why we did misery LARPing and why that was the frame was because we were trying to get a lot of other social and emotional needs met, but we didn't really, they weren't needs that we could admit in public. LARP was still primarily driven by shame when it came to understanding what was and wasn't okay and, which desires it was acceptable to admit and anyway, so during the emergency years, it was kind of the glory days of utopianism, right? The thing that we realized that we all really needed was a future that gave us hope. And we built that future and we lived that future. And then we built that future and we lived that future. As we've gotten closer to metastable, right? As we've finally started, entering the age of systems management for real, weird has become the new escapism. And, weird is perspective on our routine. There are ways in which life has gotten much more diverse, but many of those ways are not things that we choose. There's ways in which life that has gotten much less diverse because we don't get to burn energy at, 4 or 5 or 20x replacement rate anymore. So we have to live within smaller structures. Supply chains have gotten differently complicated. And that kind of input from the outside, that kind of productive instability is now incredibly useful. And in some ways, it has a lot to do with that kind of misery LARPing, where my LARP career started. But because we're more honest about our desires, because we don't have shame as that fundamental driving factor, we've built a culture that lets us get both what we need from the kind of we are humans, we are animals, we have needs in the world, but also from the we are social creators collectively building a world together. And it means that we can do that with a lot less harm. It's a lot less likely now that people get hurt in games in the way that used to sadly be kind of common. Over the past 20 years, we have learned that we can't ignore the systems around us and that our planet is a lot weirder than we knew. One of the things that has meant is that we've had to dismantle a lot of harm that the Enlightenment did to us. It really boxed in our thinking. And weird has become a critical resource in sort of undoing that sort of kind of top-down, purely rationalist approach, which we now understand really doesn't work for, managing systems in a, combined kind of simulationist and intuitivist approach. And no, I'm not going to get into the holocrat versus emergentist debate. That's find me in the bar. But this, I think, is the biggest legacy of LARP. It's helped us dismantle the Enlightenment. It's helped us finally really acknowledge and center the indigenous learning that's been helping us survive for centuries, and really to figure out how to share and become of that knowledge as equals, as in an honest way, the way we should have done 500-600 years ago. LARP has helped us ease into being humans who can live together. So, as we enter the second 50 years of LARP, remember, slow down, think deep, be weird, and remember that we are growing one planet together through play. I love you all.